Happy Monday, everybody. Happy Monday. I'll sip my coffee here for a second and let people trickle in. Got a new cup. New double-walled cup. Probably going to be seeing a lot of this. All right. Got some people coming in on locals. Got somebody on YouTube. Got somebody on Rumble. Everybody's trickling in. Happy Monday. Hi there, Carrie. Happy Monday to you. How you doing? What's the weather like where you're at? As always, the first part of the live stream. Somebody asked me about this the other day. Somebody who regularly watches these live streams, and he was confused about the nature. Hello, Esmeralda. Wintertime in Chile. Bienvenida, Esmeralda. Mucho gusto en conocerte. Te he visto en por aquí, por allá, haciendo like en los postes, y es un gran placer conocerte por fin. Hello, Nana. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, I was just welcoming Esmeralda. She's a new member here on our group. And Esmeralda, it looked like you discovered the last symptom over the weekend. Anyway, I was just welcoming her into the group. I wasn't talking behind your backs. Carrie says it's only 104 degrees where she's at. Holy mackerel. Thank you, Esmeralda. I'm a little rusty, but my daughter is half Honduran, and you have read a lot in 2 days. Yeah, well, I was hoping you would be here, and so it's a real pleasure to have you here on the live stream. What I wanted to explain before we get started here is that a member in our community, was not certain about the privacy. Let me explain it this way. So currently, we are live streaming to YouTube, to Rumble, and to locals. Now, his question was, in the second half of the live stream, when I close it down, what's the privacy of that? The privacy is only supporters on locals get to enjoy the second half of the live stream. So when I say we're going to locals only, that means that after that, the live stream closes down on YouTube and closes down on Rumble. So if there's anything that you would like to wait to have a more private audience to talk about, that would be the time to do that. And it's only local supporters. So if you're on locals, if you're here on locals watching this, when we get to that second half, you don't notice anything different. To you, nothing changes. But I want to assure you that the stream going out to YouTube and the stream going out to Rumble ends. So that's what happens for folks on YouTube and Rumble. Anyway, I just wanted to explain that because he watches almost every live stream and he wasn't certain how that works. And so I wanted to explain that. The first half is open to everybody on YouTube, Rumble, and locals. When I close it down in the second half, then it goes to supporters on locals only. All right. So sometimes I wait to talk about some of the more scandalous things or the more controversial things in that second half, and also to ask personal details about your circumstances. I wait to do that in the second half so that you have a more private audience. It's only supporters on locals. The thing on my thumb, let's get that out of the way. I cut myself over the weekend, and we're going to say, all right, just to keep it more interesting, we're going to say I was wrestling a bear, that a bear come in here, and I single-handedly wrestled this bear, and I killed the bear. That's going to be the narrative, all right? The truth, though, is that I was opening a wine bottle, and the wine bottle had a jagged thing on the side, and it was like razor sharp. So when I twisted the cork off, it sliced it sliced deep into my thumb. So the only reason I got duct tape on there is because the Band-Aid weren't cutting it. So I put some duct tape on my thumb. So, okay, that's out of the way. You guys don't have to wonder what that's all about. It's not a new fashion statement. Penny, T Spitfire, just returned to Texas, 102 degrees there. Esmeralda's in Chile, and it's winter time for her. I will say that it's been 14 cajillion degrees here, and it's just started. I can tell. You guys remember in some of the early episodes of the podcast, I said I can sense that change from summer into autumn, and because the daylight changes. Well, that's happened, and I started looking around this weekend, and the trees are starting to change. Part of that might be we've had a drought. We've had like a 2-month drought. So the trees might be changing a little bit early because of that drought. But for all intents and purposes, summer is winding down here. And Esmeralda, I imagine that por ahí está entrando el verano, la primavera. I imagine where Esmeralda is, spring's starting to come in, or summer. So, we've got a good group here today. What would you folks like to talk about? What's been on your minds that's related to emotional health and those sorts of things? Authentic recovery and emotional health maintenance. In the latest episode of Last Symptom Podcast, I described the 2 primary objectives of Last Symptom. Number 1 is authentic and permanent recovery from emotional disorders. Everything that does not fall into a category of a malfunctioning brain. So pay attention to what I'm saying. There is such thing as true mental illness. Anything that's a mental illness involves a malfunctioning brain. You cannot reason yourself out of a malfunctioning brain. You're going to need medications or some other treatments, and I don't deal with that stuff. What I deal with are emotional disorders. So that would be things like gambling addiction, which there's no such thing. There's no such thing as gambling addiction. It's just emotional disorder. Sex addiction, no such thing as a sex addiction. You can't get addicted to sex. That's just an emotional disorder. Because what are those 2 types of addiction? Is it possible for you to develop a physical dependency on gambling? No, it's all emotional. So that's emotional disorder. Is it possible to develop a physical dependency on sex? Apart from what's just natural for a normal adult human being? No. So when a person is obsessing about sex and it's got this crazy imbalanced place in their life, what is that? What's giving birth to that? Emotional disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder. It's just emotional disorder. Borderline personality disorder, the one that I had. Where does that come from? It's just an emotional disorder. And all emotional disorders are rooted in the exact same thing. The exact same thing. So I know I'm repeating myself from this latest episode of the podcast, but for those of you who haven't seen it yet, why is it that somebody can end up with one emotional disorder and somebody else ends up with another emotional disorder? What the only difference is that my individual personality type looks at a situation and says, you know what, the way I'm going to handle it, the way I think the best way of handling this is this way. And another person looks at the same thing, the same problem, and says, well, the way that I'm going to handle it is this way, which is most natural for my personality type and the way that I would just naturally approach and handle a thing. And so that's how you end up with these different disorders. But think about the fact that the root problem, the thing causing it all, is exactly the same for everybody. That's why the work that I do is really not just beneficial for people with one emotional disorder or another emotional disorder. Truly, anybody could completely rid themselves of whatever emotional disorder they have by simply learning the things that I talk about here. Esmeralda says that that's been eye-opening for her. Yeah, it was eye-opening for me too. Of course, you know, I lived for the first at least 35 years of my life with a borderline personality disorder, or just an emotional disorder. Unknowingly, I didn't know that I had that. Try to fix there we go. Fix that. I'm clear again. Yeah, so, and the more that I worked on ridding myself of my emotional disorder, the more I began to see around me in the world the underlying problem that was afflicting all unhealthy people. Well, not all unhealthy people, all people with emotional disorders. And so it's really sad that there's such a business in all this misdirection of, so if you go out into the professional world, one person will say, I specialize in sex addiction. Another person will say, I specialize in this other addiction. Another person will say, I specialize in intimacy disorders. Another person will say, I specialize in personality disorders. The big con is that none of that matters. All that matters is the root cause of these things. And that root cause is shared by everybody who has emotional disorders. And so there really is no need for you to go to somebody who specializes, for example, in sex addiction. If the real issue that they're dealing with is exactly the same thing as the person dealing with borderline personality disorder or some other disorder. You see that? Because really, by dividing these things up and putting them into special categories unnecessarily, really all you're doing is you're alienating people further and further from the problem and addressing and understanding the problem. And that it's frustrating for me, because I know that if all the therapists out there, all the psychologists out there had the same insight and were working with people in the same way, focused on the underlying issue, the numbers of people struggling with these things would be a fraction of what it is. Penny was supposed to go to Chile this month, got canceled. My daughter, one of her best friends is named Esmeralda. Do people call you Esmeralda or do they call you Esme? Because everybody calls my daughter's friend Esme. It's a beautiful name, by the way. It's one of my favorite Spanish names. Yes, what Esmeralda just mentioned is a good point. Even that emotional disorder versus mental health, even that is misdirection, and it alienates people further and further from getting to the root problem. If you're walking around and you don't know the distinction between those two things, which most people don't. I didn't when I was starting off with trying to figure out what borderline personality disorder was. If you think about it, if you don't even know the difference between those two things, emotional disorder and mental health, um, and you're using those things interchangeably, uh, it reflects a complete misunderstanding about the true nature of the thing that you are hoping to address. Mental health, I remember them saying, well, when I started off, I was going through this borderline personality disorder crisis. And the therapist had told me that I was dealing with a mental health issue. And I had all these behaviors at the time that were driving my wife nuts. And I remember using that as an excuse. She'd say, you can't continue behaving this way. And I would say to her, well, I have the professionals say I have a mental health issue. What can I do about that? It's ingrained in me. There's some kind of defect inside of me that is causing this. That was never the truth. But you see how that affects a person's perspective on what they're responsible for, what's possible for them to be responsible for, and what's not possible for them to be responsible for. So just that is misdirection and alienates people further and further away from addressing properly the thing that they've got to fix. Now, if you take that away and you say, okay, you're not dealing with a mental health issue, you're dealing with an emotional health issue, and you explain to a person what that means, there's nothing malfunctioning inside of you. It's like playing the piano and somebody has taught you how to play the piano wrong. There's nothing wrong with your brain or your fingers or the way that you approach playing, that you learned exactly the way you were taught. Is that impossible to fix? Is something that you learned incorrectly impossible to fix? No. So that now you've got hope and you've got direction. Okay, I just identify what I learned incorrectly and I adjust my understanding of those things, and that will fix the problem. Compare that to, I've got a mental health issue. I've got a mental illness. There's just some weird thing happening inside of me that I've got no control over. I'm going to need a pill or something to address that. And then, of course, if you're getting a pill for something that is an emotional health issue, it's never going to get fixed, is it? Because pills can't identify and address improper understandings about things. Only education can do that. Let me catch up to some of yous here. Most counselors don't know it. That's true, Julie. They don't know. And a lot of that is rooted in arrogance. It's rooted in haughtiness and arrogance, because they've gone and they've paid a lot of money for instructors at some university to teach them these things falsely. And it takes a level of humility that a lot of people just aren't willing to demonstrate, to say, maybe I spent all this money and I was taught the wrong thing. Or maybe there's somebody who does not have an education that costs, $50,000, who has more insight on these things than my instructors at the university did. So that's why I say it takes a bit of humility, and it's not humility that I often see. I'm not saying I never see it. I'm just saying I don't see it very often. Yeah, I've got nothing against college educations, university educations, but I will say this, that I have noticed, me being somebody who's very interested in the psychological reasons why we do the things that we do. I have seen in a lot of my close friends who have high PhDs and those sorts of things, that the whole drive for them in getting the PhD was, what do you think? Let me ask you guys. You guys know what, for an unhealthy person, what everything in their life revolves around. And now let me ask you, and it's not money. Let me ask you, what do you think I observe in a lot of my friends who have PhDs? The motives for them, uh, for that drive that they must have a PhD. What do you think that motive is? See if you guys can get it. It's something we talk about all the time. The root, or what the slavery of emotional disorder is rooted in. There you go. There you go. Chillax got it. What other people think. So I have a friend, a very close friend, and his wife. They both are in academia. She has a PhD. And my non-judgmental observation of her, and we need to talk more about non-judgmental observation. So I'm not judging her. I've just observed her and tried to understand the things motivating her. And what I have observed is that it's all about what people think. So in other words, if nobody cared, if having a PhD brought along with it no admiration, no social elevated stance, then she would not want a PhD. She would not have worked for the PhD. And she's one of these people who have a PhD in academia. You know what it's translated into for her professional life? She's a librarian. She's a librarian at a high school. And how do you think that she insists that the students call her? What do you think that they insist? She insists that how the students address her as doctor. As doctor. She's not a doctor. She has a doctorate, but she's not a doctor. She's a librarian with a PhD. And she insists that all the students call her Dr. So-and-so. Yeah. So do you see where does that come from? It comes from an improper, unhealthy concern about what other people think. And if there was no admiration to be gained from a PhD, she wouldn't have done it. So I'm not knocking PhDs or even librarians or anything like that. Here's what I'm saying. What if the reason why you want to get a PhD has nothing to do with what other people think? What if it truly is a thirst for deeper knowledge? And you don't care. You don't care whether people like it or not. And once you get your PhD, you don't advertise it. You don't insist that people call you doctor or whatever. Just call me Brian. You see how much healthier that would be? See, because, and here's something interesting about unhealthy people, people with disorders, and healthy people. Primary difference. The reward is in the thing itself. Why is the reward in the thing itself? Because healthy people view things as, in life, as the value being inherent to it or not. So it starts with us. Is my value inherent to me or not? Is there inherent value in me doing this thing, or is there not? It has nothing to do with whether people, in what other people think. But for the unhealthy person, it's all about what other people think. So let's take dieting. All right, so you want to lose 40 pounds, let's say. From the unhealthy person's perspective, where's the reward? Where's the reward in losing 40 pounds? The reward is in what people will think of me once I have lost 40 pounds. But for the healthy person, where is the reward? The real reward is in losing the 40 pounds, not in whether people recognize it or not, or what other people think. The reward or the value is in the thing itself, not in what people think. It's you guys can come up with your own examples, but let's say running a marathon. So for the unhealthy person, it's what will people think of me if I run this marathon? That's the reward. I did it. I didn't even stop once. I ran the whole 50-mile marathon. And what's the reward for the unhealthy person? What everybody thinks of me being able to do this. But for the healthy person, where's the value or the reward? The value is in the accomplishment itself, for himself or herself. The value is not in what other people think. I'm going to build my own house. I'm going to design and build my own house. For the unhealthy person or the person with the disorder, where's the reward? The sense of reward and accomplishment. It's in what people will think of my ability to build this house. So even designing the house, where you put it, how you build it, how big is it going to be, the materials you use. What's the unhealthy person doing? What materials will everybody be most impressed by? What location will everybody be most impressed by? The reward is in this imaginary concept of what other people will think. But for the healthy person, where is the reward? It's in the accomplishment itself. When I choose to how to build the house, if to build the house, where to put the house, everything driving me is in what I think will make the best house. What am I going to like the most? What looks the most beautiful to me? I'll tell you that if you're in any kind of creative field, let's say poetry, cartooning, painting, writing a book, in any of these creative things, you'll, and I know that we've got a bunch of artists and creative people here in our community, but imagine that the person is in a creative type field like that, and you put something out there. How many times has a creative put something out into the world and the world just doesn't get it? See, that's a real issue with being creative, because you're trying to do something new and fresh and it makes sense to you, but maybe it's not this huge marketing phenomenon that happens that everybody latches onto and says, oh, it's the most amazing thing ever. You've got those creative types. Those are true artists. It takes some time to sit. I just posted a painting over the weekend. I don't know if y'all saw it. I was going through Wiki Art, and I started to go right by this work of art, and something kept bringing me back to it. I wanted to understand what was the artist thinking here, because I don't get it. It doesn't look especially amazing to me, this work of art. But I said, I think there's a story there, and I want to understand that story. So I started doing some research, and I posted it on our group for you guys to enjoy. And so this whole story about folks back in the day, like if a man wanted to marry a woman, he had to have a certain amount of status and money and stuff like that. And so a lot of times he might fall in love, but he wouldn't marry until he could establish some kind of significance professionally. And that's what this whole painting was about. And the more I looked into it and investigated it, the more interesting it became. Something I didn't even notice, that there was an engraving on a tree next to him, Amy, the name Amy. which is the girl's name, but it's an old carving, and vines are starting to grow up over it. And now we get more of the story. They've been in love for a long time. They've been wanting to get married for a long time. They're standing next to this tree with where he's engraved her name. But the time is passing on, and he has not established himself in society to be able to marry her. So the reason why I bring up that story is that a lot of times it takes like an insightful person to stop and really look for value in a thing. I was talking to somebody here on a private phone call not too long ago about how love working that way, about how authentic love works that way. It's not instantaneous. It takes time, because there has to be time allowed for you to see into a person and begin to value things that are specific to them, that make them who they are. And artwork is like that too. Creative things, poetry. You know, how many poems, you cannot get the value of a poem just by brushing through it real fast. You need time to sit and reflect on it and think about what the artist was trying to communicate. What were the more profound thoughts going through his head when he was creating this thing? And it's the same thing with artwork and other things like that. Anyway, I'm getting it off on a little bit of tangent there. We're going to go to supporters only on locals. So if you ain't in our group, consider joining us over there. We're going to do that right now. Local supporters only. Here's the countdown.